All right, you lot, don't forget to give us a follow on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, and while you're at it, give us a 5-star rating. Trust me, it really does help us out. There's a few performances we saw kind of K-Mag getting to the points, Vettel kind of maybe getting a bit clearly getting let down a bit by Aston Martin. A good car, but ultimately, where do we think Mercedes are going to be next year? What do we think from the trajectory? Because the cars are very much similar, 15 mil extra ride height, but other than that, they're pretty much the same. It's felt like a stronger end to the season for Mercedes. Do we think this stands them in good stead for next year?
I think it all depends on how much they learn from the problems that they had. I don't think it's just a case of, the no sidepod concept, or maybe they should just bolt on the Red Bull side pods. I think it's all about learning the fundamental problem of where it went wrong. And to be fair, they've been super tight-lipped on even Toto Wolff, and I was even listening to a podcast with Mike Elliott, who's the actual, the guy who's designing the car now. And they're still very tight-lipped on what they're doing for next year. They really don't want to kind of give their cards away. I'm not sure. I think they do know what their car concept is going to be now for sure, but I don't think they're telling anyone.
Have they solved the problem that they had earlier this year, or have they found a temporary solution? That's like the key thing for me. Like if they've solved the problem, they know what it was, and now they can go on from there. Then maybe they might have somewhere to go next year. If what we're seeing at the moment is a temporary solution to an existing problem, then I'd be more scared about next year.
Because the thing is that, I've waxed lyrical about, Mercedes consistency and the fact that they're so close to Ferrari, given how much better the Ferrari car's been over the course of the year, how many poles Charles got, how many times they have won races. But even with that, the Mercedes still hasn't found a way to win. So that concerns me because, that gap, half a second is still too much, really. Like half a second in qualifying, that's what we kind of saw at Kota. That's still too much to really win a race without fortune falling in your favour, right? Surely.
Yeah.
We just saw an 11-second pit stop for Red Bull, and ultimately Max was still able to catch up. I do think that there are some good things about this car that have actually been kind of in the Mercedes DNA for a while. Like the tyre wear, that's very good. And even back to the 2020 car, the reason why they invented DAS is because they had tyre warm-up issues. So there's a weird kind of DNA, even though it's a different kind of car fundamentally. There's still kind of something about Mercedes about this car. The tyre wear is good, the reliability is good. So it's not all bad, and they're still challenging, for podium. So that it's not like they've dropped off massively, but I think it's just that core performance. Again, half a second away from, if you've got one of the greatest qualifiers of all time, Lewis Hamilton. There you've got George Russell, who's clearly in the right car, can challenge for wins. We saw that in Sakir, even in his one little stint in 2020. And he has kind of shown also a little bit of especially at the beginning of the season, consistency as well. So you've got two drivers. I think you've got a great team. And that's the difference, I think, between Mercedes and Ferrari, where I think if you put Lewis in that Ferrari and also the Mercedes team, if you give them that car, I think they could have scored a bit more points. So there's still plenty of positives for them to take away, but it's all about have they found that fundamental issue of why their car is not working, why they don't produce the downforce.
That's a fair point you make though, because I actually think at the same time, if anyone's going to make it work next year and then going into the following years, it's that team. Toto, Lewis, George as well have proven that they can do this. George obviously working hard with Williams to get them from a place where they were scoring no points consistently to actually be able to score points relatively, not consistently, but enough in that car.
We saw that podium. Exactly. I don't care about how legit it was. We saw that podium last year in Spa.
If anyone can do it and develop the car and get in the right place, they can. They're up against Red Bull, who obviously also have one of the best designers of all time. So
yeah, just that team in general, the Red Bull team is just operating at such a high level. I know obviously the pit stop is not looking good now, but across the board, their pit stops are A1. The Max Verstappen is in his absolute prime, and just the strategy as well. Hannah Schmidt as well, smashing.
Yeah, that's the thing. Even the best teams sometimes, I think a lot of the, I actually think when you look back at it, I think the fact that Lewis was driving at such an incredible level for those kind of 8 years where they won 8 constructors, I think that did, Mercedes could make mistakes and it wasn't the end of the world because they still had the driver and the car to turn it around. But I guess onto Lewis, there was a stage I feel like if Lewis had won that 2021 world title, I wouldn't have been remotely surprised if he'd have hung his gloves up then. What do we think now that obviously he's gone through this season where their car is in that kind of uncanny valley between the top and the top and the top of the midfield? There's been talk of, Toto said we could get 4 or 5 more years out of him. I don't know. I feel like this battle was maybe, and maybe it's unfair to think that Lewis had lost some of that drive, but when he was winning so consistently, I think being chucked back into the midfield, I can't help but feel this is like
It's a mental reset.
at another level.
And a new challenge.
And also, I mean, again, like people like Fernando Alonso, he's been in the midfield for a while now. He had that kind of shock when he went to McLaren. That's why he was so vocal, in 2015. For Lewis and Toto, this was mentally tough. You go 8 years, and for Lewis, actually, even more than 8 years, since 2007, since he came into Formula One, he's been always kind of, challenging for wins every single season. Mentally, that is very difficult to readjust yourself. And I do think that at the beginning of the season, there was a bit of a just mental shock for Lewis to kind of like almost adapt to his situation right now. But once he kind of got it under control, once he knew that, what the future was as well, what they're aiming for, I think he's almost had like a new motivation. And we just saw it, don't get me wrong, this has not been a perfect season. There were a few mistakes, I think, Spa up against Fernando, that wasn't a great one. We saw obviously in Singapore as well, but I think we saw it in that race right there. Does that look like a guy who is not motivated to win? Absolutely not.
He also looks so happy. I don't want to put emotions into his brain, but he looks really happy at the end of races. Like even after that one coming in P2, he was smiling.
Lewis doesn't hide his emotions, does he?
Yeah,
he wears his heart on his sleeve.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Bro was happy. Like he looks like he's actually having a good time dealing with a new challenge. Like I'm not saying he's any less happy or more happy than he was before. Winning loads of titles has got to be fun. But at the start of the season, it felt like he was struggling. And now it feels like he's actually like, oh no, I've got a challenge. We're going to make it happen. He's out there on track, putting it out there. So fair play to him. Today, if he'd won, it wouldn't have been on him. That would have been on Red Bull screwing up the pit stop.
Yeah, of course.
But coming P2 was on him today.
Yeah, and that's what Mercedes have consistently done this year. They've always been there to capitalise as much as they can. I mean, again, like Verstappen, it looked good at one stage. We don't know how much tyres are being managed, and he ended up getting the move done quite comfortably in the end. But I think that this shows why Lewis is so good, because look, if that goes slightly different, if that pit stop from Red Bull's like an Aston Martin pit stop that was 16 seconds instead of 11, Lewis wins the race. Like, there's a reason he's won a race in every single year he's competed in all these different, like, I know people say, oh, but he's only raced for like McLaren and Mercedes, but these cars have been like, the McLaren that he was racing in 2007, 2008 was very different to the McLaren he was racing in 2011, 2012, and he still managed to drag wins out of it. Like, and
there was also some rough years as well. I mean, 2009 actually was a rough year where it was kind of similar to this year in terms of the readjustment, and the car did get better, and he managed to win a race. So it's not all been plain sailing, but...
Isn't he also only 3 points away from being like a 10-time world champion? It's something ridiculous. Yeah. Like the stats are crazy. Like he missed out on a few championships by such a small amount.
Yeah.
Like,
I mean, he's 2007. Well, that's 2007, 2021 straight away.
Yeah, 2021, and then
2016 as well.
Yeah.
And I think even in 2010, he was like a massive out. He was like 24 points away from going into Abu Dhabi. So that was a massive long shot. But yeah, he's been around. But I think what it's reaffirmed, I haven't heard Lewis kind of come out and say that he will, be in Formula One for the next 5 years. Toto says that he's had that conversation, but in terms of forget what anyone is saying, the performance I saw is someone who is still absolutely at the top of his game, someone who in the right car, absolutely still challenging for a world championship, no doubt about it.
Yeah, and I think as well, like when you look at, well, I know you did a video recently on Michael Schumacher and how like his return, it didn't quite go, I think, as planned, and fair enough, his expectations were to jump in and, he was jumping into essentially the brawn. But I think keeping that level of consistency going for so long, like when do you think we'll see the end for Lewis? And I guess how do Mercedes... Because, he's not going to be in that car forever. And I think we can have these conversations around drivers like Alonso. I mean, Alonso feels like he can go on forever. But eventually, like, I think for Mercedes, there has to be some kind of contingency as to, what do you think the future holds for Mercedes? Because I was talking recently, about Lando Norris, for example. Like, does he maybe regret not entertaining a Red Bull move that he had? He confirmed he had talks with Red Bull. So, like, JB, do you think that... What do you think the future holds for it, both in terms of when Lewis does eventually retire and then who replaces him alongside Russell?
So my assumption is that George is getting one of the best learning experiences of his life right now. He's getting to go with a 7-time world champion who was almost an 8, and like, as we spoke, potentially more if he'd had a few things go a different way. He's learning from him. He's learning from Toto Wolff, who's managed to run a team at the top for such a long time as well. And he's learning from a team around that as well that has done 8 constructors titles in a row, obviously not this season. that is an incredible learning experience and a great opportunity. I'm not sure anyone else will get that opportunity other than George Russell. So in my head, George Russell becomes obviously the number one driver. Who drives with him is a tough question. There's questions around whether it's someone from the Mercedes ecosystem. So I don't think Ocon is probably in the running for that, but maybe Nick de Vries if he's the right guy for it at the time.
Vesti's the best
might be,
kind of F2 junior who's part of Mercedes.
Yes, I think that George is going to be the experienced driver at some point when Lewis goes. And so then you're going to want to bring in someone junior in my head to then keep the legacy going almost. Like Lewis passes the baton to George passes it to probably F2 driver, I guess. Yeah.
But also I think Toto's learned from the Nico. I mean, it's been a pretty good relationship so far between, Lewis and George at
because
Mercedes.
They're not fighting for wins.
Yeah. Exactly. We still don't know what that's going to be like for a title. Whole different dynamic.
Yeah,
and,
absolutely.
George is already even though he's having a bit of a, rough patch, I suppose you could say, he's still had an amazing season so far at Mercedes. Like he's still, obviously points don't tell the full story, but he's had a great, all those podiums. He's still ahead of Lewis in the championship. So he has been very consistent. Again, a bit of a rough patch at the moment. I think for Mercedes and Toto, when Lewis does decide to hang up his helmet, which we don't even know when it's going to be, Lewis could still go on for another 5 years. I think it'll be an interesting decision whether he wants a number two, maybe someone from the midfield. Again, maybe, de Vries. If de Vries doing a good job, but doesn't quite look like a superstar, maybe he could be like a little Valtteri 2.0. Because if George Russell is absolutely the number one, the guy who will take the throne after Lewis leaves, do you want another kind of superstar in there, or do you want a Valtteri 2.0?
See, this is what I think Red Bull want to do with de Vries. That's why I think Red Bull got him in an AlphaTauri, because I think long term they want de Vries to partner Verstappen. That's what when Perez eventually moves on.
I think it's weird with Helmut Marko and the whole Red Bull system, because they still do, by the way, on their books, all of these juniors, and they're not taking any of them. Like Lawson, I think could do a pretty decent job, but clearly thought he was not good enough to be in Formula One. So I think that whole Red Bull situation, Red Bull are letting it play out because they don't want to rush into decisions. Sergio Perez is doing a great job at the moment. I feel like, obviously, maybe not to challenge for the world title. We'd love to see Perez be able to, push Verstappen all the way, take it to Abu Dhabi. But for what they want, a good kind of harmonious relationship, I think Perez is doing just enough now. And to be fair, he's been given these kind of like 1 year contracts. Again, the Valtteri special, just like Valtteri was on Mercedes. So, it all depends on Perez, how long he can stay this close to Max, to where if the car is good enough and Max keeps winning, you don't need to change something that's broke.
I'd keep him in there.
That's it. Well, no, I guess the one thing, it kind of concerned me, but thinking as of late, so going into next year, say Mercedes do have a race-winning car. Again, like Nico, Lewis back in the day, like having two, it feels like George isn't prepared to be like the beta. If you got alpha beta, like George wants, like we saw it in Zandvoort where George was like getting a bit, feisty.
My favorite bit was actually after the race, someone in the interview actually asked him, if the team left you out for you to be a rear gunner, to Lewis on old tyres, would you have accepted that? And you could see in the back of his mind, he was like, I'm not sure why I want to be doing that, on old tyres. So he's already got that little bit of selfishness in him, which is exactly what a world champion does have.
I think it's all about the mentality. Why did Rosberg leave? Like, there's been loads of talk around how it was for him a really stressful year.
It was too intense.
It was super intense. Like Lewis has been there, done that now. And so if you had to put your money on one of the two of them coming out into the season, like, I know where my money's going.
Yeah.
It's the guy who's done it and been there and done it.
Yeah.
And if George can show the mental fortitude to beat Lewis over the course of a season in a team that probably favours Lewis because he's been there for so long, then fair play to him.
Because I think there's a way of looking at this season that I don't know if I come to this conclusion, but for sure, part of me is thinking, actually, Lewis has been quite clear of George because start of the year, it makes sense. Lewis was he was the kind of test mule for more experimental setups with this car because they've
we should say aggressive. We don't know to what extent. Of course.
We don't know to what extent, but the fact that Mercedes have said, we did that at the start of the year, we're not doing that anymore, and it's 5-0 in qualifying to Lewis in the last 5 races. I think the last 5 races
as well sometimes.
Yeah. Does that concern you, especially you as a Russell fan? Does that concern you? Because actually, the points are telling one story, but I don't know. I actually think Lewis has very much got not even the edge over George. I think he's been quite comfortably on top of him these last few races.
Exactly. I think for George also, it's not the perfect scenario to come into a team where the car is struggling straight away. But he's going to develop, throughout that team. I think he's already kind of a driver who potentially could challenge for a world title. If you put him in the 2021 Merc, if you put him in Valtteri's seat last year, I'm not saying he wins the title, even beats Lewis, but he's definitely taking it to at least the last.
Well, we
few
saw him
races.
as a kid, didn't we?
Exactly. So I think for George, it's just about kind of keeping calm at the moment, learning as much as he can. But I do think he has world championship potential. Now, there has been some incidents again, even in this race, little things creeping in, locking up and going into science, but there is something about Russell that I think he has that selfishness in him. Again, everything's calm now. The car's not challenging for titles. He's got that dog in him. I mean, we're going to see when he really gets. I think a championship level car asks a completely different question of you, and that's what we saw with Valtteri. Valtteri was amazing at Williams. People forget how good and how highly rated he was. People did think there was questions. Could this guy be a world champion? And then when he got into that race-winning car, he had the qualifying pace. He was always up there with Lewis in terms of quali, but in the races, he was never quite there. Exactly. Now, and that's the question. That's the only thing that we need to ask of Russell. Put him back in a championship-winning car with all of that pressure. I mean, the pressure in 2021, from the team principals to the drivers to everyone of the team, how is Russell going to handle that? Because I think he's got the speed, he's got the consistency, but how is he going to handle that pressure across the season?
Do you reckon, JB? Do you reckon he's got the minerals?
I think I've always thought that he's a future world champion. When that happens, I'm not sure. When it comes to Lewis and him debate, you also got to think about context. You got Lewis, who's been in a race-winning, championship-winning car year in, year out for 8 years. And you've got George who's coming from one of the slower cars on the grid into a car that is, when you say struggling, yeah, it's struggling, but not compared to his cars. So his cars were
a very different team as well in terms of the amount of people at Williams and Mercedes.
He knows the people though. He has dinner with them, dudes. He knows who he's coming into. I think that yes, George has the minerals to be a world champion one day. Whether he does it alongside Lewis Hamilton is a completely different.
And also up against Verstappen and Leclerc, because I don't know for me, and if Piastri proves to be as good as his junior career suggested as well, he had a very similar junior career coming up. Lando as well.